The story begins in the 30s in Mississippi, where young Sammy leads a hard life picking cotton, as well as sharing a humble dwelling with his parents and several sisters. Unlike him, his cousins are stylish as they return to their hometown to do business. They are the Moore twins, nicknamed Stack and Smoke, and they have their eyes on the building of an old lumber yard. The current owner of the property is Hogwood, an unpleasant man who doesn't even try to hide his racism and speaks disrespectfully to the two. The atmosphere becomes tense, and each one begins to reach for their pistol. Then Hogwood swears he didn't mean to offend anyone, and says that's just his way of speaking. Stack decides to finalize the purchase quickly with a suitcase full of money, while Smoke makes it clear that this is the full payment. This means that the property now belongs to them, and they have the right to defend their property, even in case of attacks from the Ku Klux Klan. With an air of surprise, Hogwood lets out a false laugh and assures them that this organization no longer exists. Meanwhile, Sammy is at church with his father Jack, who is a very strict pastor. He disapproves of his son's passion for music and watches in dismay as he gets into his cousin's car, taking his guitar with him. Smoke and Stack are back after living in Chicago for 7 years, and now they plan to open a bar for the black community. The young man's admiration only increases as he sees the courage of his cousins handling a rattlesnake, quickly defeating the snake. Arriving in downtown, we see that the twins' reputation is controversial around there, as a young woman begins to walk away as soon as Smoke introduces himself. However, she smiles when he says he'll pay her to watch his truck and even teaches her some negotiation tricks. Then Smoke enters his friend Bo Chow's store, who is surprised to see him and excited by his huge order for the bar. Suddenly, the horn warns that the truck is in danger, and Smoke catches 2 thieves in the act, hitting one of them in the back and the other in the leg. After that, he pays Bo to call a doctor, but he does it unnoticed because he doesn't want to risk his ruthless reputation. He also asks Bo's daughter to fetch her mother Grace from across the street, as she'll make the sign for the bar. Unlike the girl watching, Grace is an experienced negotiator, and her husband barely keeps up with the bids between her and Smoke until they come to a price agreement. Meanwhile, Stack asks to hear his cousin play the guitar and is left speechless by Sammy's powerful voice, already thinking of the fortune he will make with this guy. His future colleague is a harmonica player named Delta Slim, and Stack goes to approach him at the train station. Slim says he has been playing at the same bar for 10 years and won't risk that stable job for a bar that hasn't even opened yet. However, the conversation takes another turn as soon as he takes a single sip from the Irish beer Stack offers him, warning that he brought more bottles from Chicago. Taking advantage of the crowd on the platform, Stack puts his 2 new employees to play, announcing the opening. Sammy flirts with a woman named Pearline, but she walks away, saying she's married. Stack finds himself in trouble when his ex-girlfriend Mary arrives, who starts cursing him for running away in the middle of the night. After getting rid of the hassle, he takes Sammy and Slim to a plantation to talk to his friend Cornbread, whom he wants to hire as a doorman. Refusing the offer without hearing it, he introduces his wife Teresa and almost resorts to violence because Stack refuses to tone down his language in front of her. However, to his surprise, Teresa herself becomes interested in the pay and insists that her husband go talk to the businessman. Meanwhile, Smoke pays a visit to his ex-wife Annie, and she is the first to suspect all this ostentation, guessing that this money is stolen. Moreover, the couple has incompatible personalities because Annie is very mystical, and Smoke dismisses spirituality, retorting that all those beliefs didn't prevent the loss of their daughter, who died as a baby. Despite their differences, Smoke wants to hire her as a cook, and the two end up making amends. Not far from there, an Irishman named Remick knocks on the door of the couple Bert and Joan, both members of the Ku Klux Klan. In tears and with scorched skin, Remick says he was attacked by a group of indigenous people and convinces the two to invite him in. A little later, an indigenous leader appears, asking for the Irishman, and warns Joan that this man isn't what he seems. One of his companions informs that the sun is already setting, and he gives up trying to convince her of the truth. After he leaves, Joan begins calling her husband, and fills with horror upon seeing him fallen on the ground, lifeless. Remick, sitting in the dark with his mouth full of blood, says he's just resting. And indeed, Bert soon begins to move and even gets up, but Joan sees that something terrible has happened to him and screams upon realizing that she is next. At the same time, the preparations for the grand opening are almost complete, and the twins' bar will be called Club Juke. Sammy is surprised by Perline's arrival and becomes even happier when she says her husband won't come. He starts trying to convince her to sing on stage tonight, but the flirting is interrupted when Sammy sees Mary in the hall. Remembering her argument with Stack earlier, he goes to her intending to kick her out of the bar, but his intimidating power isn't yet up to his cousin's level. Mary not only ignores him, but he ends up sitting down to drink with her and takes the opportunity to ask an indiscreet question about her skin. She pretends to be offended, just joking, and later explains that her grandfather was mixed race. Her mother also had light skin, but that didn't lessen the clan's hate, and she was recently killed by them. Part of Mary's grief with the Moore twins is that they didn't even come to the funeral, even though her mother was the midwife who brought them into the world. Smoke warns his brother about Mary's presence, and Stack goes to talk to her, offering money for her to leave. Mary refuses to leave the bar, saying she didn't come after him and only wants to hear the music. Slim is at the piano, and the hall is already quite full when he introduces everyone to young Sammy. He sings a song he composed for his father as a way of confessing his love for the blues. The lyrics are very moving, and the rhythm captivates everyone, touching their souls so deeply that this spiritual connection is noticed by the vampire Remick. After this incredible performance, Perline completely forgets about her husband and locks herself with Sammy in a back room. Stack notices what is happening inside and feels so proud of his young cousin that he doesn't complain and even calls Grace to listen behind the door. Outside, Remick is arriving with his new clan of vampires, Bert and Joan. Seeing the three whites approaching, Cornbread predicts a commotion and calls the Moors. Remick pretends to be a blues fan and claims to have been drawn there by Sammy's talent. Smoke already arrives asking if they are from the clan, and Remick assures him they are not. To prove they are music lovers, the three pull out their instruments and start an improvised show. Stack laughs at the picturesque style and seems almost caught up in the rhythm, but Annie senses that something is wrong. Smoke also doesn't find it funny and interrupts the singing, saying that this is a blues house, a completely different style. The vampire isn't convinced by this excuse and says the three have plenty of money to spend. Not even this softens Smoke's stance, who sends the three down the road to the white bars. Hearing this, Remick pretends to be indignant and accuses the bar of discriminating against him, asking how Mary was accepted inside. Annie intervenes in the discussion and asserts that the girl is part of the family. Remick has the audacity to suggest that they could all be one big family too, and Smoke responds to that by putting his hand on his gun. Understanding the message, Remick says he will slowly leave to give them time to change their minds. The twins stick firmly to their decision and tell Cornbread to keep an eye on them, as the trio might return later with more people. A little later, Smoke talks to Sammy about the future and says that despite his talent, he shouldn't think of dedicating himself solely to music because an artist's life can be very hard. Sammy disagrees, saying he has never felt more alive than on this night, and reveals his plans to maybe move to Chicago. At the same time, Stack opens up to Mary about the bad news. Doing the math based on that night, the bar will take a long time to turn a profit and may not be able to sustain itself. Just like Annie, she also deduced that the twins stole from some important gangster, especially since the two were working for Al Capone. Stack admits that they defrauded two rival factions, but says the matter is resolved because one thinks the other did it. Mary is less optimistic and thinks it's dangerous to bet all this money on a dubious business, knowing that someone may still come to collect it back. Remembering what Remick said about being full pockets, she wants to go after them and find out how much that amount would be. Stack ends up agreeing to let her investigate and gives her his revolver, which she hides under her stocking. Meanwhile, the conversation between Smoke and Sammy has already turned into a heated argument. Sammy says that the twins' fame is embedded in the family and therefore he would never get a more traditional job even if he wanted to. Smoke doesn't want to argue about this with the kid and forbids him to play again, both in that bar and in any other in the area. He becomes so enraged by his cousin's stubbornness that he even points the gun at him, but then calms down again. Outside, Mary finds Remick sitting and playing a sad song along with Bert and Joan. Happy to see her, the three repeat that they are good people and soon let her see the money. However, Mary becomes confused when Bert hands her a handful of very strange coins, and Remick explains that those are money from other times and various countries. He also says that money won't help her heal her soul, guessing that she has suffered a recent loss. When Mary confirms this, he laments not being able to save her mother in time, but says that there is still hope for her own. This talk of salvation raises Mary's suspicion, who pulls the gun from her leg and begins to back away, not knowing that revolver bullets do not scare that kind. As soon as she turns her back, still fascinated by the coins in her hand, Remick prepares to pounce. Pearline is already letting her voice loose when Mary returns with a subtle talk and has Cornbread invite her in. She hands the coins to Stack and begins to charm him while Smoke helps Bo break up a fight. Then Cornbread asks Slim to stay by the door, saying he needs to relieve himself, and as soon as he is alone outside, he begins to hear sinister whispers. Stack cannot resist Mary's advances, and the two find themselves alone in one of the rooms, where we see the bite of the vampire on her shoulder. While still resolving the fight among patrons, Smoke tells Sammy to fetch his brother, but the boy is surprised to catch the couple in the act. He returns without his cousin, and Smoke loses patience, deciding to go find Stack himself. Mary is devouring his neck just as Smoke opens the door. Even without fully understanding, he sees his brother in agony and fires several shots at Mary, who simply stands up laughing. She says that everyone there is going to die and runs out of the bar while Annie and Slim rush to help Smoke save his brother, without success. Slim shuts down the party and sends everyone home without explaining the shots or answering questions. At this point, Annie already has her suspicions and insists that Stack needs to be taken outside, but Smoke won't let her. Grace is also afraid and tells Bo to fetch the car so they can get out of there soon. Then Cornbread returns and begins to throw around his vampire charm on the friends, but Annie intervenes and challenges him to walk to her without an invitation. When he starts to sidestep, she says he can't come in because he is dead, and that was the work of that trio of whites. Although these accusations are extraordinary, some just saw Mary survive a barrage of close-range shots. Moreover, Cornbread's behavior is indeed very strange, and now he asks for payment so he can at least leave. As Smoke reaches out to hand him the money, Cornbread grabs him and tries to bite him. Luckily, Smoke's finger on the trigger is quicker, but again the shot only knocks the vampire down, failing to hold him for long. Seeing that huge man rising with translucent eyes, Smoke runs back inside, and Cornbread is unable to follow him. It is then that Pearline warns of something even more terrible. She is hearing someone bang on the door of the room from the inside, but the only person in there is Stack. When Sammy tries to get closer, a knife pierces the wood right in his direction. Stack's voice begins to call for his brother, who peeks through the hole left by the knife, while Annie warns him that this isn't his twin. Stack begs to be let out and says that Smoke is letting his wife separate them like she always did. Just when Smoke decides to give in and goes to fetch the key, Stack knocks the door down on Sammy. Then Annie shoots garlic in his face, which begins to burn immediately, and Stack runs out of the bar screaming. In response, Annie informs everyone that they are dealing with vampires, and Grace is distressed by Bo's delay, but the others won't let her risk it outside. The only thing to do now is wait for dawn inside, keeping everyone out. As a precaution, they also begin to separate garlic cloves and tear off chair legs to make steaks. Annie explains that Stack's soul is trapped in the body, along with that monstrous version of him. She says that all they can do now is end his suffering, but Smoke is still not ready to hear that. Sammy feels guilty for challenging God with his music, and Slim gets that idea out of his head, saying he has seen the demon several times and won't let it win. It is then that someone notices an unconscious patron who now appears to have been bitten. Sammy helps Stack carry him outside before he wakes up, and the two begin to hear a macabre chanting. It is only now that they realize the mistake they made by dispersing the patrons at that moment, as Remick transformed them all into vampires. Concerned about the bitten drunk, Annie decides to test each one in the group with garlic, but Pearline refuses to eat. Smoke points the gun at her, and Sammy ends up getting beaten while trying to defend her. She finally gives in, and everyone passes the test, after a tense moment with Slim, whose digestion is complicated due to the drink. Annie and Smoke begin to think that the drunk hadn't been bitten after all, as no one checked if the puddle was really blood. Then another patron knocks on the back door and pleads for shelter, afraid of the vampires. He is attacked by Cornbread just as Stack decides to open the door. Bo appears just then, and his indifference to this atrocity reveals to Grace that he has also turned into a vampire. Then Remick appears to talk, taking advantage of the gap in the fortress, and says he really came to the bar for the music. Sammy's gift can communicate with other eras, and only then can the vampire meet some old friends again. He also reveals that Hogwood, the former owner of the building, is the leader of the Ku Klux Klan in those areas. Bert is his nephew and told that the group plans an attack on the bar the following morning. Even Stack joins in to convince everyone that vampirism is the only way out for the oppressed. Smoke is very disturbed to see his brother this way and seems indecisive for a moment. His friends prevent him from being manipulated by Stack and shut the door again, but now it is Grace who loses her head. Outraged by the others' inaction and worried about her daughter at home, she decides to confront the monsters without delay and shouts a collective invitation, allowing everyone to enter. The vampires invade the bar shortly afterward, and chaos ensues, with several parallel fights and many stakes being used. Grace shoves one into Beau's heart and lets herself burn along with him, losing all hope. Annie fights bravely with all her weapons, but ends up being bitten by Stack and reminds Smoke that he swore to free her if that ever happened. Fulfilling the promise, he plunges a stake into her chest just as she begins to revive. Even transformed, Mary is devastated by this scene and screams Annie's name while Stack struggles to get her out of there as the fire begins to spread. Slim also tells the survivors to flee and stays behind, sacrificing his own life so that the others have a chance. Perline, Smoke, and Sammy try to escape upstairs, but are surprised by Remick and Stack. The twins face off, and Perline tries to help Sammy get rid of Remick, but ends up being bitten by him. Remick chases Sammy to the river and begins a satanic baptism as all the vampires gather around the duo. Praying a Our Father, Sammy breaks the guitar over his head, injuring everyone at once. However, that isn't enough to take him down, and now Remick lunges at the boy, determined to transform him. It is then that a stake pierces him from behind, and we see Smoke came to save his cousin at the last moment. The sun finally begins to rise, burning Remick and the crowd of vampires. Smoke and Sammy embrace, watching their enemy's horrible end, which begins to dissolve as the flames consume him. After the two say goodbye, Smoke prepares for the second battle, as he hasn't forgotten Remick's warning. When Hogwood and the other clan members arrive to invade the bar, they are met with gunfire from Smoke. At the same time, Sammy interrupts his father's sermon with a dramatic entrance, and his father once again says that the demon found him through music, ordering him to drop the piece of guitar he is still tightly gripping. In the bar, Smoke uses all the weapons he had hidden in the truck all this time and manages to wipe out the entire group, but he ends up getting hit too. Seeing he won't be okay, he asks Hogwood for one last cigarette before shooting him and joining his family in the afterlife. Sammy finally chooses the guitar, and we see he dedicates himself to music until old age. 60 years after that terrible night, he receives a visit from Stack and Mary. Stack tells him that his brother didn't have the courage to exterminate him and only made him promise not to attack Sammy. Now that his end is near, Stack came to offer him a chance to play forever. Sammy refuses immortality, but makes amends with his cousin and plays again the same song that impressed him for the first time.